Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on COVID-19 and the spread of disinformation, organized by the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group and the Institute of Current World Affairs. I'm Susan Cork, Executive Director of the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group and a Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund.
And I'm Gregory Pfeiffer. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Current World Affairs. Russia, China, and other countries are exploiting the pandemic, as we know, to expand their influence, and politicians on both sides of the Atlantic are spreading disinformation to consolidate their own power. Today, we will talk about how they are doing that and how the transatlantic community can protect the democratic institutions in our countries and our societies from fake news and propaganda.
To help us understand the current nature of the infodemic, key actors and methods, and some possible solutions, we're thrilled to have two leading experts on different aspects of this issue. I'll give you just a brief overview of their very impressive CVs. Spencer Boyer is the director of the Washington office of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. He served in senior roles in the Obama administration as the National Intelligence Officer for Europe and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. Welcome, Spencer. And Ambassador Karen Kornblue is Senior Fellow and Founding Director of the Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative at the German Marshall Fund. He served as U.S. Ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and as a Policy Director for then Senator Barack Obama. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you.
And thank you both for joining us. And I see we have 26 going on 30 people signed on, and happy to see many members of the TDWG steering committee signed on, including David Kramer and Ken Wallach, Gary Schmidt, Eric Bratberg, see Ambassador Vershbow. So welcome to all of you, and we'll be coming to you later for questions. This will be an on-the-record session, and we will release a recording also as an installment of the cable podcast. Greg and I will speak with Spencer and Karen for the first 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to all of you to ask questions in the second half.
So to ask a question, please click on the hand icon at the bottom of the Zoom app to virtually raise your hand. We'll call on you chronologically, and you'll be muted until we call on you to speak. Please introduce yourself and ask a single brief question. And ICWA's Rebecca Picard is also on the line and will help respond and troubleshoot any problems. So Spencer, I'd like to start with you because you have written that the pandemic has provided fertile ground for countries such as Russia to step up efforts to sow confusion and division in the United States and Europe. Could you talk a little bit about where you've seen an increase in disinformation by foreign actors and new forms and tactics they're using to exploit the crisis for undermining democracy, especially before the election in November in this country?
Well, thanks so much, Greg and Susan, for moderating the session, and thanks to the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group and Institute of Current World Affairs for hosting this. It's really exciting to be here, and it's terrific to be with my former colleague, Ambassador Kornblue, as well. I'll keep my initial thoughts short and looking forward to our discussion afterwards. So, to begin with, the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly provided fertile ground for disinformation campaigns, foreign and domestic. People are spending more time online. Fear is widespread. There is no uniform response to fight the virus. Foreign actors in particular can take advantage of all of this to promote distrust in government, to sow societal confusion and discord, and to blur that line between fact and fiction to further geopolitical goals. Those spreading disinformation campaigns have seized on this, I think, very confusing moment to spread harmful information about health issues and voting processes, in addition to building upon other disinformation topics that they are already focusing on, including hot button issues like race and class divisions. On the foreign side, which I'll focus mostly on, who's behind all of this? Two of the key actors are the usual suspects, Russia and China. As the intelligence community that I used to be a part of, as was mentioned, and the Senate Intelligence Committee as they both repeatedly confirmed Russia continues to try to influence elections and weaken support for Western institutions. It's been well established in the disinformation toolbox that Russia has been using, that it's now being used to leverage the pandemic for its own purposes. It continues to target the US, Euro-Atlantic institutions, and the West more broadly, and is seeking to place blame on these actors for the pandemic's rise and impact. Much of the COVID-related Russian disinformation has focused on blaming the United States and NATO for the crisis. For example, Russian sources have peddled the conspiracy theory that the coronavirus was, in fact, a NATO-developed bioweapon gone wrong. And the classic Russian tool of dumping vast amounts of false information and fake stories to make the truth hard to recognize is being used to cause confusion about coronavirus health risks, which could wind up suppressing the vote in European and American elections this year. Conspiracies perpetrated by Russian media include claims that the outbreak came as a result of common vaccines, so fueling anti-vaxxing rhetoric. Bill Gates and George Soros, two favorites of Russian propaganda targeting, are being falsely linked to the spread of the virus through Russian channels. Another bogus theory that's out there is that the virus is somehow related to 5G technologies. And you have the State Department's Global Engagement Center and the EU's External Action Service, both documenting pro-Kremlin disinformation, and they've issued warnings against it. And already in this election cycle, the Kremlin has hacked targets tied to Joe Biden, supported far-right political groups, and advanced pro-Russia conspiracy theories related to Russian meddling in the 2016 election. China, on the other hand, is focused largely on rewriting the narrative about its role in the global spread of the virus. It has even put pressure on countries, especially those within the EU, to soften criticism about its pandemic response. But China also seems to be taking a disinfo approach that's a little bit more similar to Russia's than it has been in the past, designed to create chaos in the West, much like the Russian government does. It's focused on portraying Western responses to COVID-19 as chaotic and mismanaged, part of a strategy of showing how liberal democracies don't work. And Russian and Chinese disinformation actually benefit each other. You have RT and Sputnik, pro-Kremlin media outlets, as you know. They're among the top 5 most retweeted non-Chinese news outlets by Chinese state-funded media. So why does this matter? As countries are struggling to establish safe voting protocols for the remaining contests this year, targeted disinformation could further unravel public confidence. If the understandable fears that people have about the health risks of going to vote is aggravated by disinformation, turnout will, of course, suffer. And it bears repeating that the rise in pandemic-related disinformation comes in addition to the disinformation campaigns Russia is already using to target American and European elections in white. So just to close out, in the piece that was mentioned that I wrote for Foreign Policy recently, I identified 3 steps that I thought the Trump administration should take to try to counter these pandemic-related disinformation campaigns and try to protect the 2020 US elections. I'll just do the wave tops, but I'm happy to go into any of this more in our Q&A. First, the administration needs to really work with Congress to fund education efforts about voting during the pandemic. We need effective campaigns by state and local entities in particular to combat this kind of disinformation by informing the public of safety precautions in place, the availability of mail-in and absentee voting, and other essential information so citizens are encouraged to exercise their democratic right. The president's tweets just this morning about Michigan and Nevada and casting doubt on efforts to have more mail-in options available certainly doesn't help. And all of this takes money. And the next coronavirus stimulus package really does need to include the almost $4 billion that's being requested that would go to states for election assistance purposes out of the larger multi-trillion-dollar package. Second, the administration needs to stop issuing misleading, overly optimistic, and sometimes just plain false assessments about the disease. The president actually has to lead in this area. Polls from the past month have shown high levels of trust in Dr. Anthony Fauci for pandemic-related information as compared to the low trust levels for President Trump. And it certainly doesn't help when top scientific figures are prevented from testifying in Congress for political reasons. And then third, the Trump administration really needs to embrace our partnership with Europe on this global threat. the transatlantic relationship really could be especially useful now with ramped up information sharing on best practices with the EU's External Action Service and similar agencies at the national level within Europe. And I think that the president's fairly uncooperative and sometimes hostile attitude towards the EU, who he's referred to as a foe in the past, and NATO since the beginning of his term, and the lack of response coordination really risks losing the chance to collectively defend against pandemic-related disinformation and the virus itself. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Spencer. That was very comprehensive. Greg, did you have a follow-up question before I?
No, shoot, Susan.
Great. Thank you, Spencer. Your recommendations are great ones, and I think the hardest one will be to get Trump to stop doing the misleading statements. The other things like Congress funding education campaigns is a good idea for us to follow up on. Karen, if I could turn to you. In a recent GMF report, you sounded the alarm about the vulnerability of democracies to the disinformation contagion. Can you talk about how disinformation is eroding trust in mainstream news media, a critical pillar of a functioning democracy? And if you could also talk a little bit about the specific tools used by disinformation campaigns.
Yes, and I want to echo Spencer's thanks to Susan and Greg for convening this. And it's a pleasure to be on with Spencer. That was magisterial overview. So I don't know if you remember, but there was this famous New Yorker cartoon in the early days of the internet, and a dog sits in front of a computer and he's typing and he turns to another dog and he says, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. And that was, you know, a play on how unique it was that we could be anonymous. But in this report that I wrote with Ellen Goodman, who's a media law scholar, we tried to take a look at all the research that was out there about disinformation and make sense of it in a policy relevant way. We found that this idea that user interface tends to obscure what's going on online. So it's not just the anonymity, that's one thing, but it's also that, for instance, an outlet like Epoch Times, which is run by the Falun Gong, looks online in terms of font and presentation like an outlet that follows traditional public interest journalism, to be very confusing to users. And it allows a sort of arbitrage of our trust that we've built up in traditional journalism to be transferred onto some of these other outlets that traffic in false information, obscure who their owners are. They don't even have a masthead. They certainly don't follow codes and standards. And they're not public interest. You know, they have very specific interests, either political or financial, in terms of clickbait. So that starts to undermine trust in traditional journalism and increase trust in some of this disinformation. In addition, by carving up the content from these outlets so that you see a piece of content and you're not sure where it's from, you're not sure if it's claiming to be an op-ed or news, if it's satire, that also serves to really confuse users and undermine traditional journalism. So in this construct that Ellen, my co-author, had developed of signal and noise, you know, that we want to have a strong signal of information and reduce the noise of disinformation. What I've just described is how the signal of journalism gets weakened. But in addition, the noise of disinformation is amplified. And I'll just go through these four ways that we identify. One is that disinformation campaigns flood the zone. They dominate the news cycle. We used to think about an October surprise, meaning something would happen in the final days of October, right before an election in November, that would dominate the news cycle until the election, and no one would have time to correct it. Well, there's an October surprise every day. Something comes out, it's on the afternoon cable news before it can be corrected. It's in everybody's mind. So an interesting example of that was the day that Marie Yovanovitch, the ambassador, testified. A campaign was started on Twitter to spread a meme that showed Donald Trump saying, "You're fired." And it said, you know, I hired Donald Trump to fire people like Marie Yovanovitch. And just by being pushed by networks of volunteers, that wound up on Twitter trending. Twitter actually took it down, interestingly. It wasn't promoted by bots even in this case, but it was so concerted and so coordinated that they found it to be almost like spam. So there's flooding the zone. There's digital Astroturf, by which we mean, again, in traditional campaigns, Astroturf means producing the facsimile of grassroots organizing. So digital Astroturf is doing this same kind of facsimile of grassroots organizing, but online, and it happens through these groups that are organized on Facebook. So the Russians in 2016 had more followers for their fake Black Lives Matter groups than the actual Black Lives Matter groups. They organized protests between Americans on opposite sides of a street in Texas with two fake groups. Now we see white nationalists organizing among veterans and police officers in some of these groups. We also see influencers who are paid in non-transparent ways online. So this digital AstroTurf. Personalized propaganda, there's been a lot of press about this, the micro-targeted ads that, unlike ads on television, campaign ads are not subject to public scrutiny. So if there's something incorrect in one of these ads, it's targeted so narrowly that the people who would be skeptical of it, the opponent of whoever's advertising, don't get to question it, don't get to challenge it. So the FEC Commissioner, Ellen Weintraub, has said she really feels that we shouldn't allow this kind of micro-targeting. It's not really consistent with our campaign finance rules. And there's still not sufficient transparency, despite the fact that the platforms have set up these databases. They're inconsistent among each other, so it's hard to compare. They tend to be glitchy. Right before the UK election, both Google and Facebook's databases had major problems. So we just don't even have the transparency we're used to having in campaign finance settings. And then I'll just tack off the last one, which is content moderation. There's content moderation that the platforms use both in terms of their algorithmic promotion of content. So what users see in their news feed, they may think is chronological by what their friends post, but in fact, it's programmed almost the way broadcasting, lineup at night is programmed for what's most engaging. And users don't realize that. It's quite manipulative, and it means that the conspiracy theory, the outrageous thing gets promoted, not the more informational thing, despite what users may think. And then furthering this sort of opacity is the moderation after the fact, that the platforms seem to enforce their terms of service inconsistently and not apply it, for instance, to public figures. So all of this adds to the confusion and the ability of those who really want to hack the information space to do so without users really being aware of how compromised the whole system is.
Thank you, Karen. That was very informative. It was made more clear. I read your report too, which was also very good, and I learned a lot both from your remarks and from the report. Actually, after reading your report, I did a Facebook rant about conspiracy theories, and you use the site NewsGuard, and I encourage people to check NewsGuard before they post their stories. I just kind of had gotten fed up with all of the crazy conspiracy theories I was hearing repeated, including from well-educated members of my own family. So thank you. And I also just wanted to do a shout out there. I wish we could be around the table with everyone like normal. I see so many friends signed on. So look forward to post-pandemic time when we can all be back around the table again. I'll turn it back over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Susan. As Karen and Spencer mentioned, with fewer gatekeepers accountable for the quality of information online, such as traditional news outlets, people are navigating intentionally misleading information and conspiracy theories on their own. and in ways that reinforce their own views, exacerbating the polarization and fragmentation within our society. And then it seems, this has been going on for quite a while, it seems in many ways that we now have a perfect storm, a public health crisis that is prompting very real fears every day, that is reinforced when everyone goes outside every day, when you have to go outside. And you have a president who is perhaps one of the leading spreaders of lies and conspiracy theories. How serious, I mean, we've spoken about the kinds of things that are taking place, but how serious is this? How urgent should the alarm bells be ringing? Again, especially ahead of our elections. Are even experts on this topic too complacent about what may happen between now and November?
Do you want to start, Karen, or?
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I do think that it's very important that we not just look at what the threats are today, but also look at some black swan possibilities for how some of the new technologies might be able to be used in a way that might be low probability, but in tremendously high impact. So getting to your question, are we taking this seriously enough? I just imagine a scenario in which you have an attack on critical infrastructure at the same time that you have a massive disinformation campaign going out right at the time of the election, so that there's not time to correct it as people are going to vote. We're obviously all dealing with the world of deep fakes and have seen some of this poke its head, in very minor ways, images of candidates, of Nancy Pelosi and so forth, that have been doctored in a way that certainly is false. But what if a week before the election, or a day before the election, or the day of the election, there's some kind of deep fake that are not that hard to produce now? We can still do forensics on them and tell that they're deep fakes. But if you had something like that again with an attack on critical infrastructure, of one of the candidates saying something or doing something that would be catastrophic in terms of public opinion, at a time where there was an attack on infrastructure, on news outlets and so forth, so that it was hard to spread information properly about what is or isn't real. That's something that's of real concern to me. I was actually at a roundtable at the Federal Election Commission a few months ago, and I would say out of all the issues that were out there, talking with folks in industry, from nonprofits and government and so forth, there was a lot of fear that around the time of the election there could be some type of major propaganda spread, false information about the integrity of the election, about whether or not there was major fraud in voting. Again, as I mentioned in my remarks, even the president today talking about Michigan and Nevada potentially should have funds withheld from them because he thinks that they're going to cheat vis-a-vis the election. But having something like that come right around the time of the election could be really catastrophic if we're not prepared. And I do worry that there's not enough information sharing about this. There's certainly not, I think, enough coordination among news outlets about how to deal with something that's dumped on the day of an election that might seem very fishy, but people normally rush to cover stuff so that they're not left out. So that all worries me a lot.
Let me just jump in quickly. Do you have any ideas about what we could do better? I mean, the only successful example I can think of is in France, when Macron's campaign manager kind of masterfully anticipated a lot of what would happen. And, a big problem in our country has been, it's so diffuse that having a coordinated strategy and being prepared is harder. So what could we do?
I think that there's certainly a lot we could do in terms of getting everybody ready for it, and not just dealing with it on the federal level, but on the state level. And again, giving more funds to state and local entities to be able to proactively let people understand what the rules are, so that, if there are efforts to try to dissuade people from voting, as we saw in 2016, and as we even saw in 2018, with messages saying, "Hey, you can vote by text," or actually Democrats should vote on the day after the election, and Republicans whatever. Like anything that looks fishy, people need to understand where to go to get accurate information. Doing more to protect election officials, their own accounts from hacks, building up our own election infrastructure, which we need more money for, and part of the money that groups, democracy groups around the country and House Democrats have been pushing for, is $3.6 billion for election assistance to help with a whole host of issues. To make sure that we have election integrity, making sure that we have all of the infrastructure in place to be able to do the absentee balloting, mail-in ballots, security of election, polling places and so forth. But also money could be used as well to make sure that information is given about what people's options are, and I think help inoculate folks from the kind of false information that foreign actors and others might use to try to depress the vote.
Thank you, Spencer. And Karen, did you have anything further on that?
I agree with everything Spencer said. I would only add that, the pandemic is really showing us, if anybody wasn't taking disinformation seriously, it's showing us that it can be a matter of life and death. And you can completely imagine that there is a whole swath of the American public that won't take a vaccine, even if it's made available, because they'll believe that that will harm them further. People who think that I don't know if you saw the conspiracy video Plandemic that racked up millions of views before it was taken down, that said that this is created, that wearing masks can be harmful to your health. So there's a real health problem already, we have large numbers of deaths already. And so we don't, the disinformation poses a real physical danger. And then there's this whole phenomenon of undermining expertise and undermining trusted sources. So I think the American people still, if you look at polling numbers, still are trusting scientists or trusting public health officials. But the ongoing disinformation is tearing those people down, casting into doubt their what their motivations may be, that they may be trying, Bill Gates may be trying to make money off of this, off of a vaccine. Anthony Fauci is, somehow suspect. And that undermining of these experts, I think, will make it harder to deal with the current situation, but that also feeds into some of the concerns that Spencer was talking about leading into an election. When everyone is suspect, when there are no trusted sources, it makes it harder and harder for us to navigate when there's another major disinformation campaign about the election. And so, for me, the number one issue would be, can we increase funding for local journalism, which is really facing an extinction event right now? Can we hold up some trusted voices, and can we help them get their message out better? I think, the public health community is realizing that they're not doing the greatest job getting their message out. What are some of the other groups and interests in society that have the ability to get out true information, real information about the pandemic, but also about the elections? I think it's very important.
I just mention just two other things. I mean, first, I think I totally agree with everything Karen said. I think everybody has to recognize this really is a whole of society problem. It's not going to be solved just by the government or by social media companies. Really is going to involve civil society, individuals, academic institutions, and so forth, longer term in terms of dealing with this issue. But I also think that it's important to remember that there are a number of legislative initiatives that are already out there that I'm not holding my breath, certainly that any will pass between now and the election. But I think people need to remember that the For the People Act, or HR 1 that was passed by the House early last year, is the most comprehensive democracy reform package, in a generation, and has a number of components that would really help with the disinformation aspect, that we're dealing with on Corona and other issues as well. It incorporates aspects of the Disclose Act that was passed by the House, which aims to provide more comprehensive disclosure of campaign spending, and to combat the use of dark money, which opens the door for foreign influence in our elections. Has the Honest Ads Act, which is a bill that would regulate online advertisements, especially on social media platforms, in the same way that ads on television and in print media are regulated, which would increase transparency and could help with foreign influence. Then the Deceptive Practices and Voter Intimidation Prevention Act, which seeks to reduce deceptive practices used to target voter turnout. So, there are things that are on the table, and I think that people should also push their representatives and senators to act on this. And if it doesn't happen before the election, certainly soon after.
If I can just add to that, is that okay, Greg and Susan? In terms of legislative things, we put out in our report, we put out a number of things that could be done over the longer term, but 5 things we thought specifically could be done now. One is, as I said, funding local journalism, which is really being decimated right now and is such an essential pillar of a functioning democracy. We think that it could be paid for with tax on online platforms ad revenue, taxing something that's actually a challenge for democracy to pay for something that we really need. And as you know, local journalism was funded by ad revenue, and now that ad revenue has moved online. So it would be taking a portion of that back for local journalism. And we have some proposals for how to do that. Also, that the platforms originally had this soft touch regulation, which was that agencies like the Federal Trade Commission or DOJ held them accountable for coming together to form codes of conduct around issues, and then complying with their own codes of conduct. That's really evaporated, and now self-regulation has come to mean every platform can do what it wants, and it doesn't have to release any data on what's going on in their platforms or how they've done their moderation. So we think that they should have to come together to form a code of conduct and be held responsible for that by releasing data and being monitored, and that there should either the FTC needs more funding and capacity to monitor that, or there needs to be a new agency, and that there should be an update of offline laws having to do with consumer protection, civil rights, and so on for the online world. Specifically, what I talked about before, user design has to be more empowering and less manipulative, and that the platforms need to be held responsible for content that goes viral. They don't have to be held responsible for everything you post online. Go ahead and speak, but you don't have a right to reach. And so they should be held responsible for having practices that prevent harmful content from going viral. And then lastly, the micro-targeted ads that Spencer was talking about with the Honest Ads Act, absolutely need the Honest Ads Act. And then going beyond that, we really need some kind of know your customer type regime that would make sure that we don't have dark money groups taking advantage of the systems to evade transparency.
Thank you both. So I have a question then, we're talking about where we've been vulnerable and, what is needed in this country. Are there countries or communities that you see are doing a good job or better equipped to be navigating these misinformation campaigns than others?
So Europe is really trying. Right now they're debating updating their Digital Services Act, and they're looking at different ways of holding platforms responsible. They face a very different regime, though, because there are laws about hate speech. So it's just a different environment where we don't here. And but it's interesting, France just enacted a law that would require platforms to take down hate speech very quickly or face $1 million fines. And it'll be interesting to see. I mean, it's a little, I'm a little nervous about the idea that platforms will have to decide extrajudiciously what is in violation of the law and what isn't. But if they're having a more sort of proactive conversation. And I think they have, in a way, what we used to think of as laboratories of democracy, where our different states would try different things and we would see what works. I think they're doing that there with France and Germany, trying out some things as they're debating the Digital Services Act. And I should say, California now in the US has this new strong privacy bill, and we'll see how that goes. And that may inform a federal privacy law here in the States. One other thing I'd say is media literacy, which I think Spencer brought up before. Finland has an excellent media literacy program, and I think we all need to do a lot better than that. And the EU is looking at doing a lot more Europe-wide on media literacy. I think there's a lot more consciousness there about this dilemma.
And I agree with all of that. I would say, Europe overall, or the EU, is a much better job at rapid alert system to detect and expose disinformation, and working with those from member states to coordinate localized responses. And we certainly don't have anything like that in the United States in terms of coordination with states or localities to deal with disinformation. I mean, the External Action Service still has a ways to go in terms of its efforts, but I think that there are some things that we could probably learn from their efforts that we're not doing here in the U.S.
I'm conscious that we're wanting to leave time for our audience too. So Greg, I'll turn it over to you for final questions, and then maybe we can open it up.
Sure. Well, I just on the sort of transatlantic front, as we've discussed, we've had an administration that has sought to undermine the alliance and refuse to cooperate fully. But looking ahead to a new possible administration, of course, countries of the transatlantic alliance should be better positioned to rebound from the crisis because of the previous decades of cooperation. Spencer, and both of you, and Karen as well, how confident are you that we and European countries can leverage the coordination and collective security embedded in our democratic multilateral system? Can you name a couple of concrete ideas about what the U.S. and Europe should set about immediately doing next year?
I would say that, first of all, depending on what happens in the fall in terms of who's elected, whether President Trump is reelected or it's Joe Biden who's elected, I personally think that first there's going to need to be a lot of work sort of here at home in terms of rebuilding our capacity and trust within our own institutions. I would hope that if President Trump is reelected, that he has a change of heart in terms of how he's approached his own intelligence, State Department, Defense Department, and other experts within government. And certainly if there is a new administration, having a different approach towards that kind of expertise in our civil service and so forth, because before you can have robust coordination, information sharing best practices and so forth, you need to have strong institutions at home where expert civil servants, foreign service officers, career intelligence people feel that their expertise is valued, is trusted, that they can speak truth and power, that they can give honest information about how to deal with issues. And the fact that our own administration has been so divided within government about how to deal with threats from Russia, the fact that our Global Engagement Center has been so sort of underfunded and I think underused within the State Department, which is supposed to deal with disinformation by both state and non-state actors, that's a real problem. So that would be my advice: is first start at home and make sure that our own institutions have the capacity and support that they need.
Yeah, I guess, I was in the Clinton administration during the early days of the internet policy framework being built, back in the days when it was called the Information Superhighway. And we developed rules here, and then we took them to Europe, and we really led in socializing and a whole approach to the internet. And I think it's time that we worked with our allies in Europe to develop a new framework that would be interoperable at the very least, if not the same, in the US and Europe. I don't think it could be exactly the same, and that we lead the rest of the world in adopting a new approach, not one that would compromise free expression at all, but one that has a lot more transparency about some of the dark money that's spreading disinformation, that does hold the platforms responsible appropriately for practices, not content, that makes sure that that campaign finance rules, which again are very different in the US and Europe, but that the offline frameworks can hold online. It's very clear that the press and the media are incredibly important pieces of democracy, and this online environment, these are our new media gatekeepers, but we don't have a framework for holding them responsible the way we did for our old media gatekeepers. So I think that's something that we can work on together, as well as we are thinking about economic recovery. I focus on technology. What else should we be doing with our allies to think about innovation, competitiveness as we grow out of this crisis in a way that supports democracy rather than undermines it? How do we look at AI? How do we look at 5G so that we can grow our economies, but much more inclusively and with much more respect for democratic values? I think that that's something really worthwhile we can work on together and try to model for the rest of the world, and then use our foreign aid and other influence to help market that to the rest of the world.
Thanks so much to both of you for your terrific answers. Those are all our questions for our panelists, and now we'll turn it over to our participants. To repeat, to ask a question, please click the hand icon at the bottom of your screen. We'll pick you chronologically, and you'll be muted until you can speak, until we call on you to speak. And please introduce yourself and ask a single question. And we will try to get to everybody, but apologies in advance if we can't. The first hand raised was from Ken Wallach. So Rebecca, if you can spring into action and allow him to talk. Ken, please go ahead.
Thank you. You hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. And I want to thank the speakers for their excellent insights. Before I retired from the National Democratic Institute, we conducted new types of public opinion research in Ukraine, which revealed that populations most vulnerable to Russian disinformation were less likely to be educated, less likely to believe in counter messaging if the source of that education and counter messaging was government. And I wonder whether you believe that same phenomenon exists here. So I guess the question would be, who do you think are the most vulnerable populations to disinformation campaigns here? And therefore, who would be most effective in developing counter messaging? And the last thing is just a comment. If we want to learn from others on media literacy, I think we ought to also look at the Taiwanese and what they did prior to the elections there, the most recent elections there, because they ran an extremely effective media literacy effort, both in government and non-government in Taiwan. So anyway, so those were my questions.
Should I try to, I agree with you that we should look at the Taiwanese. They did an amazing job, and it was quite an onslaught. It was really, really impressive. Your question is spot on. I mean, so much of the disinformation is focused on tribal differences. And who is most vulnerable? I mean, unfortunately, it seems that everyone's a little vulnerable. In being flattered or being persuaded by what you think are folks like you to look at the other with suspicion. And so I think that the most credible speakers to help address disinformation are really those who are in communities on the front lines. So if you have disinformation targeted at African Americans, as you did in 2016, and now maybe it's even more splintered, so it's it's targeted at African American men, in these states. I think you need people in those communities contesting it. And we see some of this work being done in the census, where some of the groups, the grassroots groups, are really trying to spot disinformation quickly and push back on it. But you see it in all communities. It's rising up, and people in those communities, I think, have to be educated and have to teach their peers how to push back on it. I think there can be an infrastructure that can be made available to people who want to push back on this, and shared of, how to talk about how to question information sources. And there can be sites that people can be referred back to. But I really think it's going to have to be community by community, because I think that's where the disinformation is targeted, this tribal suspicion, cultural. The disinformation becomes a cultural battle.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. Certainly, disinformation finds fertile ground in places where there's a grain of truth to begin with, or perhaps even pushing information that is true but is divisive, and then mixing in disinformation into it. So those who are inclined to be more tribal and dug in on particular issues and are getting fed stuff that they already believe can be susceptible when true information turns to false information. I would say those who don't have any trust in government or other authority figures and entities, and maybe are getting their information from a very narrow slice of media that has a lot of disinformation in it. Obviously they're not getting other viewpoints, and so it's harder to penetrate there. But one of the things that I think that we really need much more investment in is understanding the supply side, not just the supply side, but the demand side of this information. Obviously, disinformation narratives spread because individuals find them appealing, and I think better understanding the social psychology of disinformation would help governments, independent media, civil society groups be better equipped to counter such messaging.
One example I'll give is, you mentioned NewsGuard. We did a project with NewsGuard where we looked at the most sort of blatant disinformation outlets, the ones that pretended to be promoting news, yet they repeatedly shared false information. And we found there'd been this big switch from which were the top most engaging, most successful outlets from 2016 to 2019. There'd been a shift from those that were overtly partisan to health and wellness. And so they were promoting to both the left and the right, but they were undermining authority, undermining expertise by talking about how doctors and public health officials and government, this was before the pandemic, that they don't know, and here's really the truth about health and wellness. And so you saw that, contrary to what people may think, it wasn't just people on the right, it wasn't just people on the left. They weren't appealing to people as Republicans or Democrats. It was this sort of para-political, as someone on my team described it, effort that worked across the political spectrum to spread disinformation and create fertile ground, which is now being exploited in the pandemic. So I don't think we can be complacent that it's one community or another that's most vulnerable. And I think we have to be so creative about different kinds of approaches for different communities and different speakers that can attack it.
Completely agree. So we have 5 hands raised right now. I think maybe we'll take 2 at a time, and hopefully we can get through all of the questions. So Tom Melia, you're up.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I want to echo Ken's comments and congratulate and thank the organizers and the speakers. There's a lot going on here, but I'm just going to make one comment, echoing some things that Karen said. It is really interesting, and not altogether a good thing, that civic education, including media literacy and the survival of local newspapers in this country, have now become matters of national security importance. 5 years ago, we never would have thought of them in the same sentence in the way that I think we need to now, because we need to strengthen the citizenship, our citizenry, to be more alert to the threats around them. Kind of like we were all now super conscious about the threats of the virus on every surface. I think as citizens, we need to be super alert to the threats to our democracy that are in the air, online, invisible, in ways that we have never appreciated before. And so this conversation has helped bring home this disturbing realization. That's all I want to say. Thanks.
And then I'll turn to Alice Stollmeyer, calling in from Brussels.
Hi, this is Alice from Brussels indeed. It's good to see my colleagues from across the Atlantic. I work for Defend Democracy, and in Europe, tackling domestic disinformation is considered an even more sensitive issue than tackling foreign disinformation. How is this for the United States? And do you have any idea about the ratio? And then a quick second question, if I may. So far, much of the response to foreign disinformation has been reactive. So you already mentioned counter messaging, but are there examples of other proactive responses that might be possible? Thank you.
Well, I certainly agree that it is very sensitive in the United States dealing with domestic disinformation, given that a large source of domestic disinformation is unfortunately coming from the President of the United States. And so things that should be easy as looking at foreign interference from Russia and China and so forth have really become politicized here in our system, and we see dividing lines based on whether you support or don't support the president in terms of whether you believe information or not. And so, without relitigating all of the information that has come out over the last year, including during the impeachment trial, I think that is a recipe for not being able to do it well, and certainly agree that a whack-a-mole approach to trying to deal with disinformation is not going to work. That's why I was saying that it really needs to be a whole of society approach in dealing with not only current disinformation threats, but also looking at the emerging threats and where things are going, things that might be effective now in terms of media literacy and spotting false information, maybe in 2 or 3 years as deepfakes get better and become almost indistinguishable from real media feeds and audio and so forth, is going to require a whole new level of education and trust that people have in various entities to give them accurate information, more cooperation with the private sector and others in terms of how do we regulate this? We do watermarks on deepfakes, and a lot of things that really haven't been sorted out yet. So I think we're definitely in a very difficult time period right now in the United States, and I unfortunately only see this getting worse as we approach the election.
Hi, Alice. Yeah, I think in the States, it's hard to overstate how partisan this has become. And the problem with the domestic disinformation is that it raises all kinds of First Amendment free speech issues. And that's why in our report, we really tried to get away from this debate about who should censor disinformation, the platforms or the government. And what we suggest instead is we have to fix the practices of the platforms that allow the disinformation to take hold. And we hope that if we focus on that, we can, first of all, it doesn't raise the free speech issues, the free expression issues. Secondly, we were hoping that we could get away from the platforms having to wade into partisan issues or offend political people if they could just tighten things up on the front end. And that would address both the domestic and foreign interference to some degree. And then also tying their own hands and forcing themselves to be more consistent and transparent so that they're not making judgment calls in each case and having to decide whether the president gets to say this about voting in Michigan or not. If they have clear rules and they apply them, they are forced to apply them in all contexts, then they don't have to make those kinds of decisions. But it's very hard. Once the disinformation becomes domestic and becomes politicized, it's extremely fraught and difficult. And but it's not as though these weren't issues that we didn't think about in the old broadcast context. And there, I at one point in my life I was a media regulator, and there were there was a lot of thinking done. So there are ownership caps on how many broadcast stations anyone can own, and you're not supposed to own a broadcast station and a newspaper in the same market. And there are all kinds of transparency rules about how transparent you have to be about advertising, because we thought about this. We thought about the power of the media to influence democracy and to support democracy. And I think we just have to have that kind of real conversation here, and to acknowledge how important media and information are to democracy.
Thanks for that. We will now go to Ken Meyercord, followed by Jonas.
And concluding with David Kramer with the final question.
Should we take all three at one? Okay, and then David.
Have 2 minutes to combine them all together.
All right. Can you hear me? No.
Yes.
Okay. Last fall, the CDC found 3 serious safety violations at the U.S. Army Biolab at Fort Detrick. Any one of the violations could have caused a worker at the lab to become infected with a pathogen. And all the talk about a leak at a lab in Wuhan, why is a possible leak from our own lab at Fort Detrick never addressed?
And Jonas? Jonas, you're unmuted if you want to ask your question. Okay, Jonas, we can't hear you. Okay, let's turn to David Kramer.
Thanks very much for doing this, and to Spencer and Karen, thanks very much for your remarks. There's really nothing I can disagree with what you said, but I want to pick up on Alice's question about being proactive and going on offense versus being on defense, and Spencer's term about whack-a-mole. When we talk about external actors and disinformation, is there not more that we can do to send signals that if you do this, you are going to pay a serious price, whether it's, and this should be something presumably we do with our transatlantic allies, but sanctions, targeted cyber attacks against the offenders, infrastructure attacks, exposure of corruption, embarrassing things. None of it would be engaging in disinformation on our own end, but it would be exposing the nefarious actions and behavior on the other side. Thanks.
Should we, Jonas, you want to try one more time?
Jonas, if you have a question, follow up with us afterwards and we can get the answer for you.
Call Jonas. I mean, I can mention one thing on deterrence, because I think that's an incredibly important point that we didn't really cover. Obviously, for a deterrent to be effective, the adversary has to believe that the offensive action that they're carrying out will have consequences. They have to be believable consequences. They have to, I think, be articulated so that it's clear. And I think all of us would agree that clearly we weren't able to have an effective deterrence in 2016, and the consequences for the kind of actions that Russia took weren't enough to keep Putin from doing it. So I certainly think that we need to give a lot more thought as to what those consequences will be for varying levels of interference in our democracy, whether it's a cyber attack, disinformation campaign, a cyber attack in service of a disinformation campaign, political influence. This certainly has not been articulated in this administration. We've given all sorts of mixed messages about whether we are actually behavior, and we've even asked other actors to interfere in our elections, as the president has done on a few occasions. So I fully agree that in terms of proactive steps that we can take, along with all the things that have been said about greater cooperation and coordination with the private sector and having social media companies step up their actions, legal remedies that we can take on the Hill side. I think deterrence and having a clear message from the administration is right at the top of the list.
Yeah, I agree with that. What makes it extremely complicated is that now we have domestic actors working with foreign actors. And I think that makes it very challenging for folks in the law enforcement, national security, intelligence world when they're deciding what to do. Because obviously they don't want to get involved in domestic political affairs. So I think there's got to be an articulation of what are the appropriate responses, and a real thinking through, and then some rules of thumb developed up front so that it's not up to an administration, as it was in 2016, to decide on the fly, are we going to, for instance, announce to the American people that there's a disinformation campaign going on for fear that the administration will look political by doing so. I agree that more needs to be done, but I think thinking through this tricky question about what are the rules of action is really, really important. But I don't want to, by focusing on foreign disinformation, which I think is really important, I don't want to ignore not only domestic disinformation, but also transnational white nationalist, white supremacist action, which is going on online as well. And law enforcement has called this out as a major threat. It leads to violence, and I think we're going to need to figure out some rules of the road for dealing with the organizing and conspiracy theorizing and radicalization that's going on in that context as well. These are some big challenges. They break through a lot of silos that we have in government, and I think they pose incredible organizational challenges for the government, as well as almost definitional questions, but we can't avoid them. They're absolutely essential.
Well, we are at the end of our time. Thank you, Spencer and Karen, for a fascinating analysis of a fast-moving issue. And thank you to everybody on the call for joining us and asking insightful questions. And thank you to Greg, my co-host. Go enjoy a sunny afternoon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you both.
Thank you all very much.